Welcome to Innovating with Scott Amyx. I'm your host, Scott, and today I'm joined by Brady Harris, who is the CEO of Dwolla. Welcome, Brady.
Scott, thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Now, you've spent most of your career at Elliott Management Group, leading sales. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about how that experience at that organization prepared you to lead some of the fastest growing FinTech startups.
Oh, it's a great question. I really consider myself fortunate. I was somewhat on the front end of the emerging payment space. You'll remember we all used to use those knuckle busters where you would have the carbon copy over the credit cards. And I remember selling those back in the early 2000s, right when we were converting to more of an electronic or digital terminal to capture those transactions. I've said over the years, it just provided a really good platform, meeting with quite literally thousands of business owners. I personally, gained probably 3,000 or 4,000 customers from knocking doors and making cold calls and being in business owners, in their homes and in their stores and in their places of business, primarily through the Northwest in Portland and Seattle. And it was just a great opportunity from the ground up to understand, what is payments and what do business owners look for and ask for in payments. And it was really a refining, I think, opportunity to see from a ground level all of the basic fundamentals, which is all things FinTech and payment. And that's just been such an incredible platform, and I think the lens by which I've operated in any subsequent roles over the years. So it was an incredible education, and it was difficult, but I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. It was great.
Yeah, I really like the fact that you've emphasized the need to be on the ground, to listen to the customers, and instead of trying to hypothesize, you really try to get granular around their needs as the market and the landscape changes. So sounds like you're very customer centric, so that's terrific. Now, you recently joined Dwolla, but before that, you were the president at Payscape. And while you were there, the volume has grown to over $25 billion in transactions. So be curious to know, in your time that you were there for a little bit less than 3 years, how you helped grow that organization in ways that perhaps maybe it wasn't there before you joined.
Yeah, what a great company and organization. And and when I look back on my career at some point, I'll be really grateful for those 3 years. The company you referenced, Elliott Management Group, over a 15-year span, I ultimately ended there as the president CEO. And that was a great, I think, springboard to Payscape. Through that Elliott Management Group, or EMG is the acronym, I had been part of several private equity transactions. I got to see what a scaling company looks like. I got to see what not to do. We were young, 20s and 30s. Nobody had MBAs, and we were really just fumbling our way around what does it mean to try to scale and grow an organization. And a lot of responsibility was thrust on our shoulders at a really young age. I always say we were never qualified, but we were capable to lead those teams and to grow that company. And through those bumps and bruises, and having done a few private equity transactions and taken on sponsors and really evolved and scaled our go-to-market channels, that was a great education that fit very nicely with what Payscape out of Atlanta, Georgia was looking for. This was a somewhat mature FinTech company. They had pivoted just in an amazing way back in 2013 and 14 to more of a FinTech focused product versus the highly commoditized payment processing product. Everyone can move transactions point A to point B. You charge a percentage, interchange, a few transaction fees, but it's very much a commodity. And so one thing that Payscape did, and this predates me, is they asked themselves, how can we either acquire or build peripheral products, all of which are appendages to payments and that main revenue driver, but bring real value to the customer. So they created and built from the ground up some SaaS products that one was a registration product. They built some really cool electronic billing and invoicing products that were either free or low cost, and they were able to capture the revenue. So in 2017, I had just finished a private equity transaction with EMG. The Payscape, the original co-founder CEOs, they reached out and they said, listen, we've we've reached our ceiling in terms of how we know to grow an organization. And they were really looking to bring someone in who was a hands-on operator, had go-to-market experience. They had scaled companies before and could bring some of that playbook to a great culture, to a great product lineup. And they, in all humility, you know, they said, we're willing to take board seats. We'll get out of the day-to-day. We'll trust you to run the organization. And it was just a great partnership. So I came in late 2017, early 2018, and then we transacted with Parthenon Capital about mid of last year. So it was about an 18-month run where we were able to just really scale revenue, do some really cool things from a distribution channel standpoint, and had a really successful FinTech transaction that they're now doing all kinds of amazing things, and they're going to have a great few years ahead of them.
All right, so I want to hold on to that topic around scale playbook. So I'll come back to that, which leads us to today, Dwolla. So you've joined recently as a CEO. What were some of the kind of decision points that you consider before saying, you know, I'm ready for this job?
That was, to be honest, I did not feel fully, again, qualified for the CEO role at Dwolla. You know, there were some insecurities there, in part because while it was in the payment space and that FinTech umbrella, having an API-driven product that was it's very technical in nature. And I'm a whopping 2.5 weeks into this role at this point. You know, I questioned my ability to bring my experience and that it would equate or equal value, that I could have some of the success I had had in previous roles. But as I spent time with the board, I got to know their senior team. A couple things stood out to me. One was business is business. And you can take these basic core management fundamentals, these ideas of how to diversify your go-to-market strategies. As long as you have passionate teams, you have a viable product, you can take some of these core management fundamentals, and if executed, you can have reasonable levels of success. So as I contemplated and kind of thinking through my next role, one of the really important things to me was I wanted something that could potentially be industry disruptive in terms of its technology and ways that technology could be harnessed and applied to this changing landscape of payments. And that was by far the number one attraction to Dwolla. Second behind that was the team that's in place. It's a younger team. They are motivated, they're focused. A lot of them have Silicon Valley experience, although it's in Des Moines, Iowa. And they are just primed and ready to do something really special in this industry. And I thought that was an incredible opportunity, taking some of those characteristics, putting myself on that team and trying to knock one out of the park.
Very exciting. So let me go back to the playbook that you mentioned. So what can you share in terms of your strategy to scale distribution at Dwolla? And the playbook that you referenced, there are some best practices, but then it needs to be tuned and tailored and customized for Dwolla. What are you thinking in terms of kind of the next 12 months to 24 months that you can share?
Yeah, great question. I had to have a lot. I tried to have a lot of hubris. I've always said if I was a firefighter and I showed up to a burning building, I would just throw my gear on and run into the building. And I would just try to start saving people. I'm not always as strategic as I need to be. And that can be a good and a bad thing. In using that burning building analogy, you probably ought to have some kind of game plan in terms of what floor do you go to first? What room should you try to go to? Instead of just running in this building like crazy and trying to save people. And so I've become really mindful applying that thought process, especially in the Dwolla situation, that we're deploying. It's not proprietary to me. It's a value creation planning process. DCP is the acronym. It's essentially a 90-day, very intense SWOT analysis that is going to be driven from the bottom up. Every employee in the company had the opportunity to volunteer to be assigned to a certain task force that has relevancy to a certain segment of the business. We might have product and market strategy, or we might have go-to-market strategy. We might have operational efficiencies. And so we spent a lot of time as a senior team trying to understand what are the pillars or those segments of the business that we need to have clarity and strategic alignment around. We then formed committees that was from everyday frontline employees across various departments that could participate in that. And we right now are in the throes of that VCP process, a very methodical framework that, if executed, the outcomes will be a series of strategic initiatives and having some clarity around vision and mission and values and how we're going to get there. So that's the process we're in right now. Go to market, to your original question, is a really key VCP task force. If I was to say in one statement what my philosophy is in go to market, I believe in diversifying your distribution channels, in having absolute clarity around who is your target market, what does that market ask for in terms of your product offering, and then equipping your sales teams with the resources and the tools and ensuring they have the skill sets to go to market or attack that particular segment you hope to go after.
Let's see, I have a couple of comments. Question one is, in that approach that is kind of an internal audit and looking for strengths and weaknesses and the SWOT analysis, it sounds like it's very much internally driven. Sometimes when a external leader comes in, they will rely on a consultancy, let's say Bain, Booz, and the likes. Here, you're really putting the weight on the internal employees and the existing organization to unearth those opportunities. So curious about your rationale there. And it's a good rationale. And the second question or comment is, distribution and diversification. Distribution is a little bit different in this context because we're talking about API services, and it might not be the usual distribution channels that you used to work with, because one big distribution for this could be developers, as an example, or the developer community, open source community, and so forth. So if you could address some of those questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, really great question. So to your first one, there is a risk that you don't want these committee members to bring a certain historical bias to those discussions. And so you can do some things to mitigate that. There are certainly advantages to having it from a bottom-up kind of internal process. Now, I do need to note, we've also engaged some outside consultants to sit in on these committees in certain instances to act as mentors to those that are leading the task forces. So we do have some neutrality, and we wanted to somewhat inject some contrarian points of view that could bring additional insight. But some of the things we did to mitigate that risk of falling into here's the way we've always done it type of mindsets is we mandated that we have diversity in terms of who's representing that task force. We have coding engineers that have never sold a day in their life sitting in on the go-to-market task force. Conversely, we have true blue-blooded salespeople that are sitting in on product roadmap discussions. And so that's been really valuable to have those points of view represented in these discussions. One of the other things that we've did is we have, I don't want to use mandated, we have strongly encouraged and rewarded friction and debate. And we want there to be tempers flying. We want there to be respectful debate where people come out bruised and battered, because I personally believe that out of that friction and that healthy debate can emerge some really great ideas and concepts. So that's what we've done to somewhat mitigate the first point you bring up. The second one is, the great thing about APIs is it's a way to go to market. And at the core of Dwolla's product is the ability to embed itself in a white label solution type of format with various softwares or platforms, dashboards, whatever the systems might be. But the distribution channel that I believe, if you think of a pyramid, just as a quick visual, a pyramid that's maybe segmented by 3 or 4 different levels. And each of those levels represents a distribution channel. And the size of those levels, the base being the biggest, is going to be to a certain market segment that is primarily startup in nature, Right now, we have thousands of organic leads coming to Dwolla on a monthly basis. These are technology startups saying, we need a payment solution. We'd like it to be on the ACH rails for efficiency and for cost purposes, but we don't have development resources. We don't know how to do this, and we need help integrating this into a product. So my experience from a distribution standpoint, there is some relevancy in how we think about taking this to market, whether it's through a product-led growth flywheel type of environment, whether it's more outbound focused, where you're strategically, as you pointed out, focusing on these strategic one-to-many relationships. You might be working with developers. We see a huge opportunity to not just in a traditional format, target certain markets and verticals that we hope to penetrate, or to manage the incoming organic leads we have monthly, but this one-to-many relationship, business development, strategic relationships with financial institutions. Dwolla has had a lot of success there. And the amazing thing is they never set out to actually have that be a go-to-market strategy. So you bring up a really good point that organically, that aspect of the business has really grown. It's grown organically. And I believe that if we get very thoughtful and focused around how do we expand that and really accelerate it, there is some huge opportunity to grab market share. And that's going to be a key go-to-market strategy for us.
And it sounds like on the latter part, that's an area that you have, I would imagine, pre-existing strong relationships with, and that will help pave some of these diversification and distribution while strengthening and focusing at the same time.
That's what a great point. Yeah, and that really is key. I will say, even in the first 2 weeks, I've been really lucky to kind of leverage some of those relationships I've built over the years. And we're in discussion right now with some strategic partnerships that could quite literally double or triple the current, what we call client portfolio, the number of active clients that Dwolla has just in one or two relationships. So there is some huge scaling and growth that I think we have at our fingertips in the next year or two.
Yeah, the couple of points I want to make is one is around the notion of differentiation. I think many times startups don't truly recognize the importance of unfair advantages. And unfair advantages sounds, kind of negative, but actually they're absolutely necessary for businesses to succeed. Really, the value that you bring aside from your playbook and your experience are, in fact, those relationships. And those relationships are going to allow for faster conversion and distribution that, frankly, the prior management team may not have had the opportunity, or it would have just taken much longer to cultivate. The other point that you brought that was fantastic was around this notion of friction in decision making, and I call that divergent thinking. There's an article on Forbes that I wrote around the value of dissent. Many times in corporate settings, especially larger ones, we tend to centralize around collaboration, which is absolutely necessary. But with that, there's this notion of convergent thinking. But really great ideas come when, in fact, you systematically create divergent or dissent. I love the fact that you're putting different functions that would not typically cover a certain work stream into that to purposefully create that divergent thinking. So I love some of the recipes that you're bringing in. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I love that you brought that point up of diverge. I'm going to get on that after this conversation. As a senior team, just a quick comment, as I met with our VPs and above, I said the very first thing that we need to do is foster a climate of debate. And in fact, we are reading in the form of a book club. It's the 5 dysfunctions of a team, one of which is there has to be a high level of trust where you can challenge each other, hold each other accountable, and create that environment where friction and debate occurs. And I like you, I saw that as a basic fundamental building block in terms of the team or an organizational culture. So I think you nailed it. Really good point.
Terrific. Sounds great. Well, I know you're only just a couple of weeks into this, but it's very exciting. I like what you're bringing to the organization. Tell us what you can share in terms of kind of the next year out or so around what can customers and existing partners expect from your organization?
Great question. One weakness, if I can, not a weakness, a characteristic of what Dwolla has had historically in terms of their product roadmap It's been largely reactive to the demands or the requests of its existing customers. So as you look at a product roadmap and the core capabilities and the peripheral functionality of what the API product is for Dwolla, there has not, up until the recent time, been really a deliberate strategy around where do we deploy engineering resources? How do we build this? Are we building a product and adding capabilities that not just addresses what the market wants today? Are we preemptively and proactively thinking through what we think the market will want 12 months from now or 24 months from now? And not having that deliberate strategy while they have engaged with current customers and brought a lot of functionality online, I think there's some real opportunities to get reconnected to the marketplace. So in response to your question, I would say the Dwolla product is going to be much more focused in terms of what it can do and what it can't do. That the adage of it's better to be good at one thing, versus there's a great quote that it's better to give 100% to one thing than 1% to 100 things. And I think that's a characteristic of Dwolla. And there are efforts to build the product. It's been a little bit unfocused. So definitely both current and upcoming Dwolla customers can expect a more focused, more disciplined roadmap, listening to what the market is asking for today and making sure we are prioritizing where we deploy those resources and how we develop the product in response to that. That's going to be a very key attribute of, I think, what we'll see with Dwolla.
That's terrific. My last question for you is if you can share from your career any product failures and lessons learned.
For my entire career, a few things come to mind. I talked a little bit on the Dwolla side about being somewhat driven by current customers versus a deliberate market strategy. That's certainly a big weakness or folly that I've seen throughout my career. One of the product failures I think that I was involved in is, if your listeners remember when EMV was coming to light a few years ago, this idea of a heightened security measure, largely adopted from the European Union. And in order to facilitate EMV transactions, it was requiring an entire overhaul of the ways that cards and transactions were being captured. You were having to completely reboot the terminals that sat on desks and counters. You were having to rebuild POS systems. You were having to reconfigure gateways. And that created an incredible opportunity for payment processors like the ones I was associated with to really focus on how do we put these terminals, these POSs, these systems in place to capture EMV in a time expedient manner. It was, for lack of a better term, a gold rush. There was a lot of opportunity and money to be made there. But because we were so hyper-focused on driving revenue in this EMV climate or environment, we really stopped and I thought did not do a good job at looking forward to what was going to happen after the EMV focus. And when that happened, while we were able to drive 6 or 7 quarters of really strong revenue, as everybody became EMV compliant, we found ourselves in a very reactive position, not having thought strategically through the business. And that was really impactful in a not good way to how we performed in the subsequent years. And so to me, that was a really core lesson that I learned about business, specifically from a product standpoint, that you always can't be attracted to where the dollars are today. You need a balance driving revenue, hitting your quarterly numbers with an eye towards where will this leave us 6 months from now, 12 months from now, because it's going to get there sooner than later, and you better be prepared for that.
Yeah, I think one of the responses that we get from Jeff Bezos when Wall Street analysts ask in terms of what can we expect in the next quarter or year out, his common response is, well, the earnings reports for next month or next quarter was predetermined 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's a great point, is having, looking at the tactical near term, but also having that longer cast is so critical to that balance. So today I've been joined by Brady Harris, who is the CEO of Dwolla. Thank you for joining today.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me. Great conversation.